While I was fighting in Afghanistan, the HOA president illegally rented out my house and pocketed the money. When my platoon and I returned from deployment, 12 combat veterans in dress uniforms walked into her HOA meeting. She had no idea we'd uncovered her embezzlement scheme and called the FBI. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. My name is Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, and I'm about to tell you the most insane story of HOA corruption and military justice you've ever heard. It involves a crooked HOA president who thought she could steal a soldier's home while he was serving overseas, and the platoon of combat veterans who made sure she learned why you never mess with military families. I bought my first house in Sunset Ridge, a middle-class neighborhood outside Fort Campbell, Kentucky, right after I got married to my wife Sarah. It was a modest 3-bedroom ranch house with a small yard, perfect for a young military family. Sarah was pregnant with our first child, and we were excited to finally have a real home instead of base housing. The neighborhood seemed nice when we moved in. Most of the residents were military families or civilians who worked on base. The HOA fees were reasonable and the rules seemed pretty standard: keep your lawn mowed, don't park on the grass, that sort of thing. The HOA president was a woman named Margaret Foster, a retired school principal who lived in the biggest house on the street. Everything was fine for the first 2 years. Our daughter Emma was born, Sarah made friends with other military wives in the neighborhood, and we felt like we had found our place in the community. Margaret Foster seemed supportive of military families and often organized events for deployed soldiers' families. Then everything changed when I got orders for a 12-month deployment to Afghanistan. This was my second deployment, but my first since buying the house. Sarah and Emma were going to stay with her parents in Ohio while I was overseas, since she didn't want to be alone in the house with a toddler for a whole year. Before I left, I made sure all the paperwork was in order. I set up automatic payments for the mortgage, utilities, and HOA fees. I arranged for a lawn service to maintain the yard. I even gave Margaret Foster my contact information and told her that my house would be empty but that everything was being taken care of. The deployment started normally. I was stationed at a forward operating base in Helmand Province, working as a squad leader with the 101st Airborne. The work was dangerous and stressful, but I stayed in regular contact with Sarah and tried not to worry too much about things back home. About 6 months into my deployment, I started getting strange emails from neighbors. Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door, sent me a message asking if I knew that there were people living in my house. I was confused because I had told her that the house would be empty while I was deployed. Then I got an email from my next-door neighbor on the other side, Jim Wilson, who was also military. He said he had seen moving trucks at my house and that a family had moved in. He thought maybe Sarah had decided to rent it out for extra income while I was deployed. I immediately called Sarah to ask what was going on. She was just as confused as I was. She hadn't rented the house to anyone and had no idea why people would be living there. She called Margaret Foster to find out what was happening, but Margaret claimed she didn't know anything about it. That's when Sarah drove down from Ohio to check on the house. What she found made her furious. There was a family living in our home, a man, woman, and 2 kids who had completely moved in. They had changed the locks, put up different curtains, and were treating the place like they owned it. When Sarah confronted them, they showed her a lease agreement signed by Margaret Foster as property manager for Sunset Ridge HOA. The lease stated that the HOA had the authority to rent out vacant properties to prevent them from becoming abandoned and affecting neighborhood property values. Sarah immediately called me and I could hear how upset she was. Some strangers were living in our home, sleeping in our bed, using our kitchen, and their kids were playing with Emma's toys that we had left behind. It was like our entire life had been invaded by complete strangers. I tried calling Margaret Foster from Afghanistan, but she wouldn't take my calls. I finally reached her through the HOA office number, and she gave me some nonsense story about the house being abandoned, and the HOA having the right to protect community interests by ensuring properties were occupied and maintained. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said in that condescending tone that retired teachers use, your property appeared to be abandoned. We sent multiple notices to your address, and when we received no response, we exercised our authority under the HOA covenant to secure the property. I was furious. Mrs. Foster, I told you personally that I was being deployed and that the house would be empty. I gave you my contact information. I've been paying all my fees and maintaining the property. I don't recall any such conversation, she replied. And our records show that multiple violations notices were sent to your property address with no response. It was complete lies. Margaret Foster was claiming she had never been told about my deployment and that she had sent notices to my house. The same house that she knew was empty because I had told her it would be empty. I contacted a military legal assistance lawyer, but dealing with legal issues from a combat zone in Afghanistan is nearly impossible. The lawyer said that what the HOA had done was probably illegal, but that it would take months of legal action to resolve, and I couldn't leave my deployment to deal with it. Meanwhile, Sarah was trying to handle the situation from Ohio, but she was a young mother with a toddler and no legal training. The family living in our house had a valid lease signed by the HOA, and they weren't willing to just move out. They claimed they had paid a security deposit and first month's rent and that they were innocent victims in the situation. I felt completely helpless. Here I was, serving my country in a war zone, and some corrupt HOA president had stolen my home and rented it out to strangers. Every day I was dealing with the stress of combat operations, and every night I was lying awake worrying about my family's home being occupied by people who had no right to be there. The situation got worse when I found out that Margaret Foster was pocketing the rent money. She wasn't using it to pay our HOA fees or property maintenance, she was keeping it for herself. She had essentially turned our house into her personal rental property and was profiting from my military service. That's when I decided to reach out to my platoon. These guys were like brothers to me and several of them were from the Fort Campbell area. When I told them what was happening, they were as angry as I was. Stealing a deployed soldier's home while he's serving overseas is about the lowest thing you can do. My platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Davis, had been in the Army for 15 years and had seen every kind of corruption and abuse you can imagine. He told me not to worry about it and that they would handle the situation when we got back from deployment. Sergeant Thompson, who was from Kentucky, said his cousin was a lawyer who specialized in military family issues. Specialist Martinez, whose father was a retired cop, said he knew people who could help investigate the HOA's financial records. The whole platoon was ready to go to war against Margaret Foster and her corrupt HOA. When our deployment ended and we rotated back to Fort Campbell, I was expecting to have to fight a long legal battle to get my house back. But my platoon had other ideas. They had spent the last few months of the deployment planning what they called Operation Home Sweet Home. The day after we got back, 12 combat veterans in full dress uniforms showed up at the HOA meeting. Margaret Foster was not expecting to see a squad of soldiers who had just returned from Afghanistan walk into her little community center meeting. Staff Sergeant Davis, who could be very intimidating when he wanted to be, stood up and addressed the room in his command voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to discuss the theft of Sergeant Rodriguez's home while he was serving our country overseas." Margaret Foster tried to maintain control of the meeting. "This is a private HOA meeting," she said. "Military personnel have no authority here." "Ma'am," replied Sergeant Davis, "we're not here in any official military capacity. We're here as concerned community members and friends of a soldier whose home was stolen while he was in combat." Then Sergeant Thompson's lawyer cousin, who had been working on the case pro bono, stood up and began presenting evidence of the HOA's illegal actions. He had financial records showing that Margaret Foster had been keeping the rental income for herself. He had documentation proving that no violation notices had ever been sent to my address. He had sworn statements from neighbors confirming that I had informed Margaret Foster about my deployment. The other HOA board members were clearly shocked. Most of them had no idea what Margaret Foster had been doing. They thought the house had actually been abandoned and that the HOA had followed proper procedures. But Margaret Foster wasn't backing down. She started yelling about how soldiers get special treatment and how the HOA had every right to protect property values by ensuring homes were occupied. She claimed that military families were transient and unreliable and that the community was better off with stable civilian residents. That's when things got interesting. Specialist Martinez stood up and announced that his father's investigation had uncovered something very interesting about Margaret Foster's finances. It turned out that she had been skimming money from HOA funds for over 2 years, using various fake maintenance and administrative expenses to steal thousands of dollars from the community. "Mrs. Foster," Martinez said calmly, "would you like to explain why you've been writing HOA checks to a landscaping company that doesn't exist? Or why you've been billing the HOA for office supplies that were never delivered?" Margaret Foster's face went completely white. She realized that my platoon hadn't just come to complain about my house. They had conducted a full investigation into her criminal activities. The other board members immediately called for an emergency vote to remove Margaret Foster as president. The vote was unanimous. They also voted to immediately terminate the illegal lease on my house and to return full control of the property to me. But we weren't done yet. Staff Sergeant Davis announced that the evidence of financial crimes had been turned over to the local district attorney's office. Margaret Foster was going to face criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Within a week, the family that had been living in my house had moved out. The HOA paid for professional cleaning and repairs to restore the property to its original condition. Margaret Foster was forced to reimburse the HOA for all the money she had stolen, plus damages. But the best part of the revenge was yet to come. Word of the incident spread throughout the military community at Fort Campbell. Margaret Foster became known as the woman who stole a soldier's home while he was serving in combat. Her reputation in the community was completely destroyed. The local newspaper picked up the story, and it went viral on social media. Margaret Foster received hundreds of angry messages from military families and veterans across the country. She became a symbol of civilian corruption and disrespect for military service. The criminal charges against Margaret Foster resulted in a conviction for embezzlement and fraud. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and to my family. The judge specifically mentioned that her crime against a deployed soldier was an aggravating factor in the sentencing. Margaret Foster lost her house when she couldn't afford the legal fees and restitution payments. She moved away from the area after being released from prison and was never seen in the neighborhood again. The new HOA leadership implemented strict oversight procedures to prevent future corruption. They also passed a resolution formally recognizing the service of military families and promising to support deployed soldiers and their families. As for my platoon, they became legends at Fort Campbell. The story of how 12 combat veterans took down a corrupt HOA president spread throughout the base. Several other military families who had been having problems with HOAs reached out for advice and support. My house was returned to me in perfect condition, and Sarah and Emma were finally able to come home. The neighborhood rallied around our family, with neighbors apologizing for not doing more to stop Margaret Foster's illegal actions. The incident taught me an important lesson about the power of brotherhood and standing up for what's right. Sometimes when you're dealing with corruption and abuse, you need people who are willing to fight alongside you. My platoon brothers had my back when I couldn't defend myself, and together we made sure that justice was served. Today, I'm still living in that same house in Sunset Ridge with my family. The neighborhood is peaceful and well managed under honest leadership. And every time I see one of my old platoon members, we smile remembering the day we proved that you don't mess with a soldier's family while he's serving his country. Margaret Foster learned the hard way that some fights aren't worth picking, especially when your opponent has a squad of combat veterans for backup. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and sometimes justice comes in the form of 12 soldiers in dress uniforms walking into your corrupt little meeting. The military teaches you to never leave a man behind, and that principle applies to defending each other's families too. My platoon made sure that a crooked HOA president learned that lesson in the most memorable way possible.